When we look at Indiana's economic geography, we have to look at some changes, and so we have to start off by looking at some history. So we look at the 20th century. What were the key economic sectors in the state of Indiana? No doubt agriculture was key. So a primary sector activity, agriculture, absolutely important to the state. But most people already know that. In fact, that's what most people think of Indiana as being nothing but corn and beans, corn and beans, corn and beans. And the agriculture industry is very diverse. It's changing, but it still plays a key role. And that makes sense. It's super flat. Much of the northern part of the state and the central part of the state, and even in the southern part of the states, you have little areas here and there where agriculture can be quite successful. So our climate in general, combined with our topography, we're always going to have a very good agricultural industry. Even further, there's a slew of major urban areas, for example, Chicago, Indianapolis, scattered throughout much of the Midwest, which would need the agricultural products produced here in Indiana. We look at also in the 20th century, that's where Indiana became an auto parts manufacturer. So essentially, we look at the Indianapolis 500 and the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was initially built and designed to test cars, to test parts, to test ideas. It wasn't really designed as a place to have 300,000 drunken idiots inside a track watching cars go in circles. It was actually designed to test products because here in Indianapolis, but also throughout much of the northern part of the state, we have this competitive advantage in creating and building and making auto parts. Initially, we were churning out a lot of automobiles, but of course, Detroit became the dominant automotive part of the Midwest in terms of manufacturing actual automobiles, and that's the big three. But one of the problems with that is they have an over-reliance on producing cars, which makes us nice as we produce parts for different cars, and so we're always going to be in demand as far as our parts. But historically, we were heavily connected to the big three. We're heavily connected to Ford, Chevrolet, and Dodge, Chrysler. So because of that, we grew in the 20th century, but as those have started to fall, so as the big three in Detroit have started to decline, we've definitely seen some changes. I'll get to that in a minute. Also, we have the role of steel in northwest Indiana. So northwest Indiana, all along the Lake Michigan coastline. So essentially, we do have a coastline in Indiana, a coastline or access to a large water body. So because of that, we had the steel industry really develop there in northwest Indiana. It really thrived throughout the 20th century. So why? Because the steel, the raw materials could be brought to northwest Indiana via Lake Michigan, railroads and all of that. But then also the steel could then be sent out via Lake Michigan. So the role of a port is absolutely critical to understanding the steel industry. Even further, we also have to understand the role of automobiles. And so nearby Detroit, we've got all these automobile parts and stuff manufactured here in this particular area of the country. 75% of a car historically was steel. So as cars grew, as more and more people wanted cars, then thus the steel industry grew. Also, steel became increasingly used in terms of construction, in terms of building buildings and building tall skyscrapers. So we look at Chicago, all that steel downtown, all those big buildings, all those skyscrapers, more often than not utilize steel from northwest Indiana. So we see the primary sector and secondary sector really dominant in Indiana historically.